So this is the Fujifilm GFX 50R, and I've brought it here to the Dolomites in winter to do some landscape photography with it. And it's a really nice camera. So a couple of years ago, in 2017, Fujifilm put out the GFX 50S, which was a medium format, 50 megapixel camera with an SLR format. And I used it. It's a beautiful camera. The image quality is absolutely exceptional. I took it with me to Tuscany to do some shooting with it, and I really did like it. But it's a very big camera. It didn't really fit in with how I like to shoot and how I like to travel, because generally I like to go as light as possible. This is much smaller. It's got a rangefinder format, so it doesn't have the big bump on the top where the viewfinder is. It's got the viewfinder on the left, and it is much smaller and much lighter. I was quite surprised when I picked it up because it was lighter than I expected it to be. It's 775 grams, which makes it a little bit lighter than a DSLR. And with the lens, this is the 32 to 64 f4 zoom. It's a mid-range zoom. It's about a 28 to 50. Correct me if I'm wrong, more or less that equivalent on full frame. So it doesn't give you the same reach, for example, as the 24 to 70, but it is actually a little bit lighter. So this kind of kit, it's really not that much different to a full frame pro level DSLR. It's probably a little bit lighter, but yeah, it's not an f2.8 lens, and the lens doesn't have the same flexibility, but it is quite a light kit. It is surprisingly light and quite portable, and it was a pleasant surprise for me when I picked it up and started using it, and I've been lugging it around with me in a backpack for a couple of days now, and it's not been too much of a problem yet, bearing in mind I'm also carrying the X-T3 kit and a drone and stuff like that. So yeah, it's actually really quite portable, and the size isn't as much of a problem. It isn't as big and bulky as the previous generation, as the GFX 50S. It's got all the same technology in here. So you've got the same 50 megapixel sensor, you've got the same autofocus, but it is in a much smaller and considerably cheaper body. So because it's a rangefinder format, it's got a slightly different layout of controls to cameras like the X-T3 and the 50S. You've got no buttons on the left side, and pretty much all the controls are here on the right hand side. Now it is, like all Fuji cameras, incredibly intuitive to use, but there are a few things that they're not really problems. They're just things that I noticed after shooting so much with a camera like the X-T2 and X-T3, which took me a while to get used to, because you have a muscle memory and you're sort of like, things don't feel the same way that they normally feel. So for example, on the X-T3, this is the on-off button. You click it on off here, and this is actually the ISO button. And I found quite often that when I've been at the end of me shooting, when I've gone to flick it off, what I've actually been doing is flicking the ISO button around and changing the ISO. And there's no lock here, so I like the idea of having the ISO so accessible. It's much better than on the X Pro 2, where it's underneath the shutter control and you've got this kind of double dial. It doesn't really work for me, so I do like the fact that the ISO is so accessible, but it's taken me a while to get used to, and the on-off button is here. Now it's got a lot of function buttons all over the back of the camera, which are really nice. Most of these are completely configurable, so you can take things from the menu and attach them to the different function buttons. There's two on the top, there's one on the front, a lot across the back, and also because it has a touch screen, the touch screen gestures are also configurable. So you've got flick from the left, flick from the right, up, down. You can put different functions from the menu, just the same as any of the newer Fuji cameras like the X-T3. And I really do like that. I really like the fact that I almost never have to go into the menu now. The controls are really intuitive. There are a few problems that I noticed with the layout, things that didn't really work for me, considering this is a camera that's designed for street photography. Some of the buttons here on the right don't really balance well. So for example, if you're trying to press the Q button here, you have to move your thumb down this bulk button, and the camera doesn't feel secure in your hand. You really want to secure it. So it's not that accessible with one hand. Likewise, this function button here is a little bit hard to access because you're reaching over the top of this bump. But you know, these are small gripes. They're just design features that have been incorporated, because in a rangefinder camera you have to basically have all the buttons on this side. There's not space on that side or here, because where the viewfinder is, to put the buttons. So they're basically concentrated around the right hand side of the camera, where it's really quite easy to you know, to function with your thumb. And there are a few, as I say, that don't really work that well. One thing that I do like is the fact that the focus button on most cameras, it's on the front here. They've moved the focus button on the back, single, continuous, and manual focus. I really like that a lot. And overall, I find it really intuitive to use. It doesn't have a really deep grip, as you can see here, but because the camera is quite solid, it's quite thick, doesn't really need it. It feels really secure in your hand when you're carrying it around. And you can see I don't use a strap. I almost never use a strap when I'm shooting. It feels really secure. I don't feel, you know, get a really good grip on it, and I'm quite comfortable using it with one hand, with just the exception of reaching those buttons. But for the most part, it really has a really nice ergonomics. It balances really well, and it's just a pleasure to shoot with. Now, there are a few design decisions that Fuji have made to try to keep the cost of the camera down. So, for example, there's no D-pad on the back of the camera. Now, it's a shame. It's something that I really miss, because I do use the D-pad a lot. It's great for moving your way through the menus, and I like the fact that you can assign the function buttons. But as I said, this does have a lot of function buttons that you can assign anyway, and it does have the joystick, which you can use as a focus selector to put the focus where you want to, and for moving through the menus. So that's really nice. It also has a tilt screen. This, for a landscape photographer, is incredibly useful. We've been shooting a lot in quite deep snow on this trip, where we have the camera about 1 meter off the ground. So the fact that you've got a tilt screen means you can stand up. You don't have to kneel in the snow, which is really not that pleasant after about an hour or so. So I do love having a tilt screen, but as I say, in order to keep the costs low, it only tilts on the horizontal axis. It doesn't tilt when you're in portrait mode, so you can't really, it's something I miss, but I do understand why Fuji have done it. You've got 2 card slots here, and on the other side here, you've got a connector for remote control, which again, really useful if you're a landscape camera. So generally, yeah, the buttons and the features, everything works really well. There's a nice kind of stiffness and solidity about the buttons. You can't move them accidentally. They feel really nice. Everything's metal. The build quality is really good. I should talk about video. I don't think anyone buys a camera like this as a video camera. Why would you? This is purely designed around still photography, but it does have some video functions. It doesn't have 4K, only full HD, and it doesn't shoot in log. So basically the video capability is similar to something like the X-T20, but I have shot some video with this, and the video does look really, really nice. It's just, as I say, if you want a 4K video camera, this really isn't the camera for you. So using this in the field, it really is a pleasure to use. There's a solidity about it, a purpose. It just feels really good. Having this on the tripod, shooting with it, there's something about the build of it, the solidity. It kind of encourages you to slow down, take your time, and really, really work with the camera. I really did like using it, and it's incredibly durable. On the very first morning shooting, we were up at the top of Marmalada Mountain, which is at 3,200 meters. And we were down to -23, which is pretty extreme temperatures, and the camera still functioned perfectly well. Now, it burnt through the battery quicker than the normal, because cold's are going to do that. It completely killed my iPhone 7 stone dead. That just didn't work after 10 minutes in the temperature. But the camera kept shooting through the blue hour right the way through sunrise. I didn't get as many shots out of the battery as I would normally expect to, but it did work at -23. The next day we were shooting, and it was comparatively warm. It was about -7 where we were, and after a full session shooting, we just went through 1 bar of the battery. So battery life doesn't really seem to be a problem, and it's pretty capable of dealing with even extremes of temperature. I've been using it in the snow and not had any problem with it. It really is a beautiful camera to use. It's a pleasure to use it in the field, but you buy a camera for this for image quality. And what about the image quality? Well, let's have a look. Right, so let's have a look at some of the files from the GFX. So the first thing that you're going to notice is that they're really big. They're about 110, 120 megabytes, which is pretty much double the size of what you're going to get from an X-T3. But what you're getting in all of that data is really, really well detailed images. So let's just zoom into this. Now, because I'm just doing this on a laptop while I'm traveling, and because the files are so big, it's going to take them just a few seconds to render when I zoom in. But you can look, if we zoom out, that's this detail in these trees here. We zoom into 100%, and there's just so much detail being recorded, looking all the way up to the top of these peaks. It's just, there's really a lot of detail there, so much resolution, all those 50 megapixels. It's just really quite fantastic. Let's have a look at another one taken in when the light had come up. These are taken from the top of Marmalada. As I said earlier in the video, it was about -23 when we were recording this, and the camera was still functioning pretty much for most of the session, but by the end of the session the battery had gone completely flat. But we managed to get through the session with just the one battery. And just zooming in here with the lights hitting these cliffs, this is the Cellar Towers in the Dolomites, and yeah, there's a lot of detail there. If we look up to the top, to the horizon, we can pick out things like this mountain hut, which, I don't know, that's a good couple of kilometers away from where we are, and these peaks just going back, these are all the way across the border in Austria or Switzerland, I think. It's just, yeah, there's really a lot of detail there. So let's have a look at the dynamic range. So this shot here was taken on another morning. We were shooting, it was about -6. And this is the kind of image where I would normally expect to be bracketing, because I'm shooting some dark peaks and the sunrise is coming up behind the dark peaks, where usually you just wouldn't expect to be getting any detail. You'd be losing some of the detail in the shadows or losing something in the highlights. And you can see here that the camera has recorded really a whole load of dynamic range. I originally shot this to bracket it, but it doesn't need anything. It's the whole of the dynamic range is there. It's clipping a little bit these highlights here, but I can pull these back quite easily, and you can see that, you know, that's the entire dynamic range of a very wide dynamic range seen captured in one shot, in one frame. If we have a look at this one here, this is kind of the opposite. Apologies for the composition here. When I took this, I was kind of hunting around to try to find a better composition. Just let me reset this. So you can see it's a little bit underexposed, and there's just no detail in the shadows in these trees on the left. It's just a bit of a black mass. So if we just pull out the shadows just a little bit, you're already seeing the level of detail there. You don't need to pull it out any more than that, maybe a little bit more, but there's so much information captured on this sensor, so much stored in the files, that really the capacity that you've got, the flexibility that you've got to pull detail out of the highlights, of the shadows, is incredible. And even before you need to start doing that, there's already so much captured just naturally in the dynamic range of the camera anyway. And just if we look at the sky here, there's just no noise whatsoever. They're really clean files. There's a sensor spot there. Apologies, these are raw files. I haven't cleaned them up or done anything to them. But there's just no noise. They're just really, really clean files. Now, one thing that I did notice, this isn't a disadvantage, it's just I've spent a lot of time shooting wide angles with the X-T3. Now, if you're shooting a wide angle with the X-T3 and you're shooting in the mid-range of the aperture, you've got really, with the 1024, for example, you'd have a depth of field which starts at something like 40 or 50 centimeters in front of the camera and goes to infinity. So it's very rare when I'm shooting with the X-T3 and I'm shooting wide angle that I worry about depth of field, because pretty much that 50 centimeters in front of the lens is usually below the foreground of the shot anyway. It's usually out of the image. So usually you can get one shot with the entire depth of field, unless you've got some really close focus in the foreground, like a flower or something like that. Now here I noticed as soon as you step up to full frame and then go to medium format, then you start to lose depth of field. And you can see here, this is a shot that on the X-T3 I'd have been able to do it in one frame. If we zoom in here, you can see that the foreground is just really sharp. You can just see that you can make out the crystals and the snow, this grass. But when we look up at the peaks in the background, you can see that it's out of focus. And it's just making sure that it's rendered. It's just out of the depth of field of the shot. So when we look at this one is focused for the midground actually. So you can see here the midground is sharp, but also the mountains are now crystal sharp. So if we look at them side by side, just zoom in, you can see the difference. Let's just lock that in the foreground here. If we look at this, let's see if I can find that bit of grass again. You can see there the huge difference in the depth of field here with foreground in focus. Here the foreground is completely out of focus, but when we look up at the mountains, we're going to see a really big difference. So on the right, mountains are really sharp and detailed on the left side of focus. So it's just, if you're coming from an X-T3, if you're coming from an APS-C camera, you're going to notice that there's a difference in the depth of field, and where you were perhaps managing to get by with one shot before, you're probably going to have to focus blend or something like that. But it's a small price to pay, and it's not even a price to pay. It's just a difference that's worth noting. But overall, just looking at the quality of these images, it really is superb. The dynamic range, the detail, just everything about them, the color that's recorded, they really are absolutely wonderful, wonderful quality. So it's almost 4 years now since I switched from a full frame system to the Fuji X system, because I really wanted to travel smaller and lighter, and I really did like the smaller form factor of the XT series. So I'm not naturally inclined to love a camera like this. I prefer smaller cameras, but after using this on this trip, I really do have to say I love it. I've really fallen in love with this camera in a big way. It's just a pleasure to use. The image quality is just breathtaking. And I really do like it a lot. Now, if the only thing that you do is photography, this is probably a fantastic camera. Things get a little bit more complicated if, like me, you shoot a lot of video. So you've got like a video kit and you need to have a 4K video and you need to be shooting F-Log and you've got a drone, then your bag really very quickly gets very heavy when you're shooting with a GFX kit, because you're going to need 3 lenses, a wide angle, a mid-range zoom and a telephoto, and quite quickly that makes your pack really heavy. But if you're just doing photography, a kit like this with a GFX 50R, this mid-range zoom, the 23mm wide angle and something for telephoto, it's actually not going to be that heavy. If you're happy carrying a full frame kit, then you're really not going to notice the difference with this. It's probably going to be about the same weight, if not a little bit lighter. So it's a fantastic thing that Fuji have done here. They've basically made a medium format camera for a similar cost and a similar weight value to a full frame DSLR system, and that I think is absolutely amazing. And I'm really curious to see where Fuji take the system in future, because it's been about 2 years now since they announced their medium format system. So it is still a very new system. It's still maturing. They're still adding new lenses every year, and there's a lot more room for it to grow. There's more room. This year they've announced a 100 megapixel camera, and you can see that they've got on the roadmap there are more lenses to come. So this is a system that's going to grow and grow, and I really do admire what Fuji is doing. And to be absolutely honest with you, it's going to be hard to give this camera back to Fuji at the end of this trip, and I'm really looking forward to shooting with this some more over the next week or so. So that's pretty much it for this review. I hope it's been useful and I hope it's been interesting. As ever, if you've got any comments whatsoever, just drop me a comment or send me an email and I will try to get back to you. And in the meantime, thanks for watching and take care.